I never told my parents I was a federal judge. To my status-obsessed family, I was just a downtown paper pusher, a massive disappointment who refused to play their superficial games. So when my golden child sister ran over a man on a dark Atlanta road, my mother did not hesitate to sacrifice me. She dug her manicured nails into my shoulders and ordered me to take the fall. "Just say you were driving," she demanded, because my sister had a city council campaign to win, and I, apparently, had nothing to lose. I looked at the bleeding man on the asphalt, then at my father stepping up to say I was a nobody. My sister smirked, wiping her fake tears, silently asking who would believe me anyway. That was the absolute last mistake she ever made. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family. The metallic crunch of the impact was still ringing in my ears, muffled only by the torrential Atlanta rain beating down on the asphalt. A few yards away, a man lay motionless in the street. Blood was pooling around his head, mixing with the engine oil and washing away into the dark storm drain. The front end of Chloe's brand new Range Rover was completely caved in, hissing thick white smoke into the freezing night air. I had only been in the passenger seat because my own car was in the shop, and my mother had demanded we all attend some trivial country club mixer to boost Chloe's city council campaign. Now standing in the relentless downpour, Vivian, the esteemed first lady of my father's megachurch, was not praying for the dying man on the pavement. She was not calling for help. She was frantically pulling at the lapels of my tailored trench coat. "Take off your coat, Kendra," she hissed, her voice sharp and panicked over the sound of the rain. "Put on Chloe's jacket and get in the driver's seat right now." I stared at her, the freezing rain plastering my hair to my face. "I am not doing that, Mom," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "A man is bleeding out in the street. You need to call an ambulance immediately." "Call an ambulance," she shrieked, her eyes wide with manic desperation. She grabbed my arms and shook me. "Do you want to ruin your sister? The media will have an absolute field day with this. You are just a downtown paper pusher anyway. No one cares if a low-level government worker gets a reckless driving citation. Your sister has an election to win and a reputation to protect." Chloe was pacing back and forth on the shoulder of the road, completely oblivious to the rain ruining her expensive silk gala dress. She wasn't looking at the victim struggling to breathe. She was staring at the cracked screen of her phone. "The polls open in 3 months," she sobbed, her voice trembling with pure selfish terror. "If this gets out, my opponents will destroy me. I can't have a vehicular assault on my record. My donors will pull their funding by morning." That was when Preston stepped into my personal space. Preston was Chloe's husband, a wealthy white campaign manager who walked through life with the unearned arrogance of a man whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Georgia. He pointed a long, accusing finger inches from my face, his breath reeking of the expensive bourbon he and Chloe had been drinking heavily all night. "Listen to me, you ungrateful nobody!" Preston sneered, his voice dripping with condescension and racial microaggressions he usually saved for closed doors. "My family's public relations firm will spin this entire situation. You will take the blame tonight. You will do a few months of light community service, and I will write you a check for 50 grand tomorrow morning. Do not ruin Chloe's beautiful life just because yours is so utterly pathetic." I swatted his hand away, maintaining direct and unyielding eye contact. "You are out of your mind if you think I am taking the fall for a drunk driving hit-and-run, Preston. You can keep your filthy money. I am not going to prison to save a drunk driver." A heavy thud drew our attention back to the wrecked vehicle. My father Jeremiah was leaning deep into the driver's side of the smoking Range Rover, vigorously wiping down the steering wheel with a microfiber cloth he kept in the glove box. As a megachurch pastor with a congregation of 10,000 devoted followers, he was currently orchestrating a felony cover-up with practiced efficiency. "You have always been so incredibly jealous of her," Jeremiah scoffed without bothering to look back at me. He tossed the cloth into the back seat and slammed the heavy door shut, walking over to join the circle surrounding me. "You have been bitter ever since you lied about getting into Harvard, running off to some mediocre state school just to spite us, and ending up in a miserable government job making pennies. We are offering you a way to finally be useful to this family, Kendra. For once in your life, do what you are told." The absolute audacity of his rewritten history made my jaw tighten. I took a step toward the man who had always treated me like an unwanted burden. I did not lie about Harvard, Dad. I said, my voice cutting sharply through the heavy rain and thunder. I turned down Harvard because I refused to let you pay my tuition with money you skimmed from your congregation's tithes. I went to Yale on a full academic scholarship completely free, something you could never stomach because you could not buy the credit for it or brag about paying for it. And my miserable government job is a choice, not a punishment. Jeremiah laughed, a deep, booming sound that he usually reserved for his televised sermons when he was putting someone in their place. A choice, he mocked, shaking his head. Nobody chooses to be a low-level city clerk, Kendra. You failed to secure a corporate law firm position because you completely lack your sister's charm, beauty, and ambition. Now get in that driver's seat before I cut you out of my will entirely, and make sure you never find work in this city again. I did not have to answer him. The piercing wail of police sirens cut through the storm, red and blue lights reflecting brightly off the wet pavement and the shattered glass of the Range Rover. Two squad cars screeched to a halt, blocking the intersection and casting long, harsh shadows across the scene. A third vehicle, an ambulance, pulled up right behind them, medics immediately jumping out to attend to the bleeding man on the ground. The moment the patrol car doors opened, Chloe's entire demeanor shifted. The selfish panic vanished, instantly replaced by the flawless, calculating performance of a terrified victim. She threw herself against Preston's chest, bursting into loud, theatrical sobs that echoed over the sirens. Officer Chloe cried out as two patrolmen jogged toward us with heavy flashlights. "Thank God you are here. My sister was driving. We tried to stop her, but she was acting so erratic. We begged her to slow down, but she just would not listen to us." Vivian immediately chimed in, pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest to cement the lie. She grabbed the keys from Chloe at the party. Vivian lied, her voice thick with manufactured trauma. We were terrified of her behavior. She just lost control of the vehicle and struck that poor innocent man. We are so traumatized. One of the officers, a stern-looking veteran with rain dripping heavily from his hat brim, walked straight up to me. His bright flashlight beam hit my face, blinding me temporarily as he assessed me as a criminal suspect. "Ma'am," he said, his tone heavy with suspicion and authority, "I am going to need to see your driver's license and registration right now. Step away from the vehicle and keep your hands exactly where I can see them." I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me with a triumphant, malicious warning in her eyes. I looked at my father, who crossed his arms confidently, fully expecting me to accept my designated role as the family scapegoat. And then I looked at Chloe, who was peeking out from Preston's protective embrace, smirking at me through her fake tears. Her expression clearly asked who would believe me anyway. I reached slowly and deliberately into the inner pocket of my tailored trench coat. I did not pull out a driver's license. I pulled out my heavy leather credential case. I flipped it open and held it up directly into the beam of the police flashlight, letting the solid gold federal seal catch the harsh glare of the cruiser lights. The officer held my heavy leather credential case under the harsh glare of his tactical flashlight. The freezing Atlanta rain pounded against the gold seal of the United States District Court, but the engraved lettering was unmistakable. I watched the realization wash completely over his face. The rigid and suspicious posture of a cop dealing with a potential criminal suspect vanished in a single heartbeat. He snapped the case shut and handed it back to me with a visibly trembling hand. He stood ramrod straight, completely ignoring the rain soaking through his uniform. "My sincere apologies, Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking slightly with deference. "How would you like us to proceed with the scene?" The absolute silence that fell over my family was deafening. For a fraction of a second, the only sound on that dark road was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers on Chloe's wrecked Range Rover. Chloe stopped, her fake theatrical sobbing mid-gasp. "My mother." Vivian stared at the officer, like he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. My father, Jeremiah, simply let his jaw drop, his hands freezing where they hung by his sides. Then Preston's arrogant laughter broke the heavy silence. He stepped off the curb, his expensive Italian loafers splashing carelessly into a puddle of oily water. He shoved his way past my father and pointed a long, aggressive finger directly at the officer's chest. Preston was a man who walked through life with the unearned confidence of generational wealth, assuming his white privilege could buy his way out of any consequence. Are you completely out of your mind? Preston sneered his breath, reeking of the premium bourbon he and my sister had been drinking heavily all night. Do not play games with me, officer. I know exactly who this woman is. She is a low-level city clerk who stamps property deeds for pennies. That badge is either a novelty prop or some diversity hire credential they give to the back office staff. My father owns half the commercial real estate in this district. I fund your department pension. I am telling you to arrest her right now for stealing my wife's vehicle and causing this accident. The officer did not even blink at Preston. He did not shrink back or apologize. Instead, he kept his eyes respectfully locked on me, waiting for my instruction. The sudden shift in power was palpable, and Preston absolutely could not handle it. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He grabbed the officer by the shoulder, shaking him slightly. Did you hear me? I want her in handcuffs. If you do not put her in the back of that cruiser right now, I will have your badge sitting on my desk by morning. I took a slow and deliberate step forward, forcing Preston to back up or risk touching me. Officer, I said, projecting my voice, so every first responder securing the perimeter could hear me clearly. You will completely ignore the man in the ruined tuxedo. He is currently intoxicated and interfering with an active crime scene. Please call for a forensics unit immediately. I want the dashcam footage from that Range Rover extracted and secured on site. Do not let anyone from the towing company touch that vehicle until the data is legally preserved. Furthermore, the woman in the red dress is the driver. Administer a field sobriety test and a breathalyzer immediately. Chloe let out a genuine piercing scream of terror. The reality of the situation crashed down on her, shattering her golden child armor. She lunged toward our father, burying her face in his jacket. Daddy, do something, she wailed. He cannot breathalyze me. I had 4 martinis at the gala. My campaign will be over. The polls open in 3 weeks and my donors will drop me by morning. Jeremiah puffed up his chest, attempting to weaponize the massive spiritual and political weight he carried in Atlanta. He walked up to the officer, putting on his best pastoral voice, the deep, comforting tone that usually commanded 10,000 devoted followers every Sunday morning. Son, let us take a breath and think about the community, he said smoothly, sliding smoothly into his role as the great mediator. I am Bishop Jeremiah Sterling. You might recognize me from the fellowship breakfasts your precinct captain attends. My daughter Chloe is a dedicated public servant who just experienced a terrible trauma. My other daughter Kendra is clearly suffering from a severe mental health crisis tonight. She is confused and erratic. Let us handle this privately as a family matter. There is no need for tests or cameras or creating a scandal. The officer stepped back, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt, creating a physical barrier between himself and my father. Bishop or not, sir, you need to step behind the yellow tape right now. I am taking my orders directly from a federal judge. If you or anyone else interferes with my investigation, I will arrest you for obstruction of justice. The reality of the situation finally pierced through Vivian's profound delusion. The aggressive media spin was failing. The untouchable megachurch influence was failing. Preston untouchable generational wealth was failing. The only person holding absolute undisputed power on that dark and bloody street was the daughter she had spent 34 years treating like an embarrassing afterthought. Vivian marched towards me, her designer heels clicking furiously against the wet pavement. Her expensive silk press was completely ruined by the rain matting against her scalp. Her heavy makeup was running down her face, stripping away the flawless country club facade she guarded with her life. She stopped inches from my face, her chest heaving with pure, unadulterated rage. Cancel those orders right now, Kendra, she hissed, her voice vibrating with malice. Tell him you made a mistake. Tell him you were driving. You owe us this. We clothed you. We fed you. We allowed you to share our respected name when you were nothing but a stubborn, difficult child. I looked down at her, feeling 30 years of emotional abuse wash away in the freezing rain. You fed me conditions, Mother, I said, my voice dead calm. You clothed me in shame because I refused to be a superficial prop in your fake holy empire. I earned my name and I earned my gavel. I am not throwing my life and my career away to save a drunk driver who does not even care about the innocent man currently bleeding out behind her. Vivian's face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of hatred. Without warning, she drew her hand back and struck me hard across the face. The sharp, stinging crack of her palm hitting my cheek echoed loudly over the sound of the pouring rain and the idling police cruisers. "You selfish, ungrateful brat," she screamed, spit flying from her lips. "I should have left you at that miserable public school. I should have let you rot with the commoners instead of trying to make you into somebody. You are destroying this family." I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand to touch my stinging cheek. I just stood there, letting the cold rain wash over me as I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I slowly turned my head back to meet her furious gaze, maintaining absolute chilling judicial composure. "That slap," I said softly yet loud enough for the approaching officers to hear, "just earned you an assault charge on a federal officer. Handcuff her." The neon hum of the Atlanta Police Department downtown precinct was a world away from the rain-slicked asphalt, where I had just left my family in absolute shock. 2 hours had passed since the patrol officers escorted me away from the wreckage. I did not ride in the back of a squad car surrounded by cage wire. Instead, I sat in the passenger seat of the shift lieutenant cruiser while he updated me on the victim condition. I was currently sitting in the plush leather chair belonging to Chief of Police Montgomery. He had rushed in from his home the moment his desk sergeant informed him. A sitting United States District Court judge was involved in a high-profile collision involving a city council candidate. The chief handed me a fresh espresso in a ceramic cup, which was a stark contrast to the stale break-room coffee usually reserved for late-night visitors. Through the frosted glass of his office door, I could hear the unmistakable commotion building in the main waiting area. Preston had arrived. My white brother-in-law did not just walk into rooms, he invaded them. He brought with him a high-powered defense attorney named Harrison, a man well known in Atlanta for making severe criminal charges disappear for the right price. I watched their silhouettes pace back and forth through the glass. Chloe was clinging to Preston's arm, playing the traumatized victim to absolute perfection. Her designer dress was still damp from the rain, but she had managed to fix her makeup, ensuring she looked camera-ready for the tragedy she was actively framing me for. My mother Vivian was right beside them. The patrol officers had released her with a strict warning after her outburst on the street, mostly because I had instructed them to stand down. I wanted her free to keep digging her own grave. Now Vivian was using that freedom to terrorize the precinct lobby. Her voice was shrill and carried across the entire bullpen, cutting through the ringing telephones and police radio chatter. She was loudly demanding that the desk sergeant book me immediately. "She stole my daughter's keys at the charity dinner," Vivian shrieked, making sure every exhausted third-shift officer in the room heard her fabricated narrative. "She is unstable, and she has always been dangerously jealous of Chloe. This is exactly like the time she refused to pledge my legacy sorority and embarrassed our entire bloodline just to join some miserable downtown mock trial team. She loves destroying this family. She needs to be in a holding cell before she hurts anyone else." Hearing her twist the past was nothing new. My mother viewed my entire existence as a calculated attack on her elite social standing. Because I valued justice over wearing pearls and throwing garden parties, I was branded the enemy. Now she was using that same toxic playbook to frame me for a violent felony. My father, Jeremiah, joined the chorus, stepping up to the intake desk with his chest puffed out. He attempted to weaponize his megachurch influence, leaning over the counter to intimidate the young desk sergeant. "Son, I am Bishop Jeremiah Sterling," he said, his voice dropping into that deep, commanding register he used to secure millions in tithes. "My family contributes heavily to the Police Benevolent Fund. We host the mayor at our estate. We are asking you to process a dangerous woman who stole our vehicle. Do not make me call your superiors and explain that you are protecting a criminal while my traumatized daughter stands here shivering." Preston slammed his fist against the reinforced glass of the reception desk, completely losing whatever tiny shred of patience he possessed. "I am not asking you. I am telling you." Preston barked, his face flushed with bourbon and rage. "My father practically built the commercial districts in this city. You will process Kendra Sterling for grand theft auto and vehicular assault right now, or I am ending your career. Where are you holding her?" Harrison, the defense attorney, adjusted his expensive silk tie and smoothly added that they were prepared to file a massive civil rights lawsuit against the department if they did not secure me in handcuffs immediately. The desk, looking completely unbothered by the millionaires throwing a temper tantrum in his lobby, simply pointed a thumb toward the chief office. Preston did not wait to be announced. He marched over to the heavy wooden door, grabbed the brass handle, and threw it open violently. He fully expected to find me chained to a metal bench in a windowless interrogation room, weeping and ready to beg for his financial mercy. He wanted to see me broken so he could swoop in and buy my silence with a $50,000 check. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth fell open slightly as he took in the scene before him. The sterile precinct lighting illuminated the room perfectly. I was casually sitting behind the massive oak desk, sipping my dark espresso with my legs crossed. Chief Montgomery stood respectfully beside me, holding a digital tablet and nodding as I reviewed the traffic division protocols. I did not look up right away. I let Preston stand in the doorway looking incredibly foolish, as the reality of the room failed to match his delusions of grandeur. Chloe and Vivian crowded into the doorway behind him, their expressions shifting from righteous anger to utter confusion. Jeremiah hovered in the back, trying to peer over Preston's shoulder. The arrogant bravado that fueled my brother-in-law faltered for only a fraction of a second before his intense generational entitlement roared back to life. He marched right up to the desk, his face contorted with unchecked fury. "What kind of circus are you running in this department, Montgomery?" he demanded, slamming his hand down so hard the espresso cup rattled sharply on its saucer. "Why is this criminal sitting in your leather chair while my wife is forced to stand in a public lobby? I want her processed, fingerprinted, and thrown in a holding cell immediately. Arrest her right now, or I swear to God I will have your badge and your pension stripped by morning. My family owns the politicians who sign your paychecks." Chief Montgomery did not flinch. He had served the city of Atlanta for 30 years, and he had zero tolerance for wealthy bullies trying to dictate the law. He slowly crossed his thick arms, looking at Preston with a mixture of profound pity and deep amusement. The chief glanced down at me, seeking quiet permission to end this charade. I took a slow sip of my espresso and gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. The chief looked back at my furious brother-in-law and let out a dry, raspy chuckle. "Let me get this straight, Mr. Preston." The chief said, his voice deadly calm and echoing loudly into the silent hallway where my parents stood. "You are threatening to take my pension because you want me to arrest a sitting federal judge for a hit and run. You want me to put her in handcuffs when I am holding 4K resolution intersection camera footage right here in my hand. That clearly shows your wife behind the wheel holding a champagne flute while she ran that man down." Harrison, the defense attorney, immediately took a massive step backward, physically distancing himself from Preston. As an officer of the court, Harrison knew exactly what it meant to threaten a federal judge and lie to a police chief. "I have not been formally retained for any criminal matters regarding a hit and run," Harrison stammered quickly, raising his hands in surrender. "I was brought here under the impression this was a simple property dispute over a stolen vehicle. If there is video evidence of a felony involving a political candidate, I am withdrawing my counsel immediately." Preston turned to his lawyer, his eyes wild with panic. "You cannot leave me here, you coward," Preston spat, grabbing the attorney's sleeve. "My father pays your firm a retainer for exactly this kind of problem. Fix it right now." Harrison yanked his arm away, shooting Preston a look of absolute disgust. "Your father pays me to handle contract disputes and zoning variances, Preston. He does not pay me to participate in a conspiracy to frame a member of the federal judiciary for a violent crime. You are completely on your own." Harrison turned to me, giving a stiff, respectful bow of his head before practically sprinting out of the precinct lobby. I finally set my espresso cup down on the desk. The soft clink of the ceramic was the only sound in the room. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored trench coat. I looked directly at Chloe, whose makeup was ruined by genuine tears of terror. I looked at my mother, who was trembling so hard her jewelry rattled. I looked at my father, whose megachurch empire suddenly felt completely worthless. "You wanted me to take the fall because you thought I had nothing to lose," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a scalpel. "You thought because I did not care about country club memberships or designer labels that my life was expendable." but my life is dedicated to the law. And the law does not care about your campaign, your tithes, or your fragile social standing. You played a very dangerous game tonight and you just lost everything. The heavy precinct doors slammed shut behind me as I walked out into the cool Atlanta night. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the downtown streets slick and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. I took a deep breath, letting the sterile air of the police station leave my lungs. I had just watched my family unravel in the span of 30 seconds, but I knew Preston was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. His entire existence was built on the premise that his generational wealth could insulate him from any consequence. If he could not buy the police chief, he would buy the narrative. By the time I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, my phone was already vibrating violently against the center console. A barrage of notifications flooded my screen. My college friends, former colleagues, and local political aides were all texting me links to the same website. It was an infamous Atlanta gossip blog known for destroying careers and carrying water for the city elite. I tapped the link, and the headline screamed back at me in bold black letters. City Council candidate, Chloe Sterling traumatized after troubled sister involved in downtown crash. I read through the article with a mixture of absolute disgust and clinical fascination. Preston PR team had worked with terrifying speed. The article completely fabricated the events of the evening. It claimed that I, a disgruntled and unstable government worker harboring deep-seated jealousy over my sister's political rise, had taken her keys without permission. It painted Chloe and Preston as the tragic victims who had valiantly tried to stop my erratic behavior before I caused a horrific accident. The spin was sickeningly calculated. Preston was using his white privilege and his family media connections to weaponize my privacy against me. He assumed that because I did not flaunt my wealth on social media or attend their superficial country club galas, I was an easy target. I honestly believed public opinion would pressure the police department to drop the footage and sweep the truth under the rug. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the article, my phone rang again. The caller identification displayed the bishop. It was my father, Jeremiah. I accepted the call and put it on speaker, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Kendra, my father said, his deep pastoral voice dripping with artificial warmth. I am glad you picked up. We have a situation, but nothing we cannot fix if we all just work together as a family. I stared straight ahead at the wet pavement. You mean the situation where you tried to frame a federal judge for a felony, or the situation where your son-in-law just defamed me in a local publication? Jeremiah chuckled, a low, dismissive sound meant to make me feel small. Let us not use such dramatic words, Kendra. Preston was just doing damage control. You know how vicious the media can be during an election cycle. Chloe is on the verge of securing a major council seat, and we cannot let a simple misunderstanding derail her entire future. We saw the blog post. We think it is best for everyone if you just lean into the story. Issue a public apology. State that you were overwhelmed and made a mistake. You want me to publicly confess to a crime I did not commit, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I want you to be a team player for once in your miserable life. Jeremiah snapped, his comforting pastor facade cracking instantly. Listen to me carefully. I know you have been struggling on whatever meager salary the government pays you. If you go along with this PR strategy and take the heat off your sister, I will personally wipe out your Yale student loans by noon tomorrow. All of them gone. You can start fresh. The absolute delusion of his offer made me grip the steering wheel. My family was so blinded by their own arrogance, they had never bothered to learn a single fact about my life. I paid off my student loans 5 years ago, Dad. I said, my words striking like ice. I did it by working hard and earning my place on the bench. I did not have to dip into the church building fund to finance my life the way you do, to finance Chloe designer wardrobe. I could hear my mother, Vivian, shouting in the background, her shrill voice bleeding through the phone receiver. Tell her she owes us, Jeremiah. Tell that selfish brat she owes this family. Jeremiah cleared his throat, regaining his aggressive composure. You do owe us, Kendra. Your mother paid for your braces. We put clothes on your back. We gave you a roof over your head. You have walked around with a chip on your shoulder for 30 years, acting like you are better than us. It is time to pay your dues. You will release a statement to the press by morning, corroborating the blog post, or I swear I will use every connection I have in this city to make sure you are disbarred and ruined." I let his threat hang in the air for a brief moment. "You still do not get it, do you?" I said softly. "You cannot buy me. You cannot intimidate me. And you absolutely cannot threaten me. My courtroom does not play by your megachurch rules, and the law does not care about your country club status. Do not ever call this number again." I pressed the end call button, cutting off whatever hollow threat he was preparing to hurl at me next. The silence in the car was deafening, but it only lasted for a few seconds. My phone immediately rang a third time. I glanced at the screen, expecting another barrage of abuse from my parents, but the name flashing on the display made my posture straighten. It was Jamal, my senior federal clerk. Jamal was a brilliant legal mind who practically lived at the courthouse. If he was calling me at 2 in the morning, it meant something critical had just hit the wire. I picked up the phone. "Jamal, tell me you are getting some sleep," I said. "Not tonight, Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice buzzing with high-stakes adrenaline. "I was monitoring the overnight incident reports, just like you asked me to when you took the bench. I flagged the hit and run from downtown. I cross-referenced the victim name from the police report. You need to hear this immediately." "Go ahead," I said, putting the car in drive and pulling out of the parking space. "The man your sister hit is Malik Jackson," Jamal explained rapidly. "He is not just a random pedestrian. He is a prominent housing activist. For the past 6 months, Malik has been working directly as a confidential informant for a federal task force. He has been gathering hard evidence on illegal zoning practices and tenant evictions." My blood ran cold. The pieces of the puzzle started slamming into place with terrifying precision. "And who exactly is the target of this federal task force?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Preston Family Development Group," Jamal confirmed. Malik was scheduled to hand over a massive hard drive of financial documents to the FBI next week. Documents that prove Preston Company has been bribing city officials to seize property in lower-income neighborhoods. But, Your Honor, it gets much worse. I merged onto the highway, the neon lights of the Atlanta skyline reflecting in my rearview mirror. "Tell me, Jamal." "I ran the plates on the wrecked Range Rover from the accident report," Jamal said. "The vehicle is not registered to your sister or to Preston personally. It is registered to Chloe Official Campaign Committee. It was leased using campaign funds. That means Preston was using political donations to finance their luxury lifestyle." I took a sharp breath as the legal reality of the situation expanded into something massive. If the vehicle was a campaign asset and Chloe used it to run down a federal informant investigating her husband's real estate empire, this was no longer a local traffic dispute. This just became a federal crime. I stated my mind, racing through the statutes. "We are looking at campaign finance fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit vehicular assault." "Exactly," Jamal said. "The local police chief just kicked the entire file up to the federal level because of the informant status. The FBI has officially taken over the investigation, and because of the jurisdictional rotation, the digital case file just dropped into our system 5 minutes ago." I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a surge of absolute clarity. The universe had a fascinating way of delivering justice. My family had spent the entire night trying to destroy my life, assuming I was completely powerless. They had mocked my career, insulted my character, and demanded I sacrifice myself to protect their superficial empire. They had no idea they had just handed me the very hammer that would shatter their entire world. "It is on our docket," Jamal asked, his voice filled with quiet anticipation. I looked out at the dark highway, a cold, determined smile touching my lips for the first time that night. "Yes, Jamal," I said, "the case is mine. Prepare the subpoenas and draft the preservation orders for all of Chloe campaign financial records. I want every bank account tied to Preston real estate firm frozen pending federal review. We are going to war." 2 days later, the Buckhead Heritage Country Club was completely illuminated, like a beacon of hypocritical wealth. It was a $10,000 a plate campaign gala for Chloe. Preston had pulled out all the stops to bury the bloody hit and run under a mountain of expensive champagne and high-profile political endorsements. The local blogs were still running with his fabricated narrative, painting me as the troubled, unstable sister, while Chloe was being heavily praised as a brave public servant, pushing through family adversity. Valets were frantically rushing to park luxury vehicles under the grand portico, while a string quartet played softly over the sound of clinking crystal glasses. I sat in the back of my hired black town car watching the elite guests filter through the towering columns of the main entrance. These were the absolute power players of Atlanta. The wealthy deacons from my father megachurch were mingling seamlessly with Preston family network of corrupt commercial real estate developers. They were all gathered in their finest evening wear to fund a criminal enterprise disguised as a progressive city council campaign. They were shaking hands and writing massive checks, completely unaware that the woman running for office had nearly killed a federal informant just 48 hours prior. I stepped out of the town car, and the crisp night air hit my face. I was not wearing the sensible dark suits I usually wore behind the federal bench. Tonight required an entirely different kind of armor. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green gown that swept the marble floor with a structured asymmetrical neckline that commanded immediate attention. It was a breathtaking piece I had commissioned from an independent black designer in Midtown, paid for entirely by my own federal salary. It screamed power and untouchable confidence. It completely shattered the pathetic, destitute narrative my family had sold to the city. I walked up the wide stone steps, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. A young valet rushed forward to hold the heavy brass doors open for me, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my commanding presence. I did not sneak in through the service entrance or the kitchen. I walked right through the main lobby, past the extravagant floral arrangements and the massive blown-up campaign posters of my sister's perfectly airbrushed face. I had barely made it past the bustling coat check when a sharp hand aggressively grabbed my wrist. It was Vivian. My mother was decked out in her standard First Lady uniform, an overly embellished silver gown, heavily draped in diamonds that were undoubtedly paid for by the congregation tithes. Her face beneath her flawless makeup contorted with a vicious mixture of absolute panic and furious indignation. She yanked me hard, pulling me behind a towering display of white hydrangeas attempting to hide my presence from the wealthy donors milling about the grand foyer. "What on earth do you think you are doing here?" Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. Her eyes darted frantically toward the closed mahogany doors of the main ballroom. "We told Preston's security team to explicitly ban you from the premises. Are you trying to destroy your sister completely? Have you lost your mind showing your face tonight?" I smoothly removed her hand from my wrist, brushing the fabric of my emerald gown as if her touch had physically stained it. "I am simply attending a public campaign event, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and maintaining unyielding eye contact. I wanted to see exactly how much dark money Preston was funneling through this room tonight to cover his tracks. Vivian looked me up and down, her critical gaze catching on the intricate beadwork of my dress and the heavy diamond drop earrings I wore. Her arrogant assumption that I was a broken failure clashed violently with the undeniable wealth standing right in front of her. She could not comprehend how the daughter she had emotionally discarded could afford to stand in this lobby looking like royalty. Her confusion quickly morphed into toxic condescension. "How did you afford that dress?" she demanded, her tone dripping with venom. "Are you drowning in credit card debt just to show off for people who do not even want you here? Or did you steal from the church offering plate again to finance this little stunt?" The sheer audacity of her bringing up the church offering plate made me smile. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Vivian take half a step backward. She had always used the past as a weapon to keep me submissive, but she had severely miscalculated my current jurisdiction over the truth. When I was 19 years old, the megachurch accountants noticed $20,000 missing from the building fund. Vivian had immediately panicked and blamed me. She told my father and the board of elders that I was a rebellious teenager acting out because I was deeply jealous of Chloe. My father had dragged me before the church elders, forcing me to publicly repent for a financial crime I never committed. The absolute truth was that Vivian had skimmed that exact amount to pay for Chloe elite pageant coaches, her custom evening wear, and her exorbitant entry fees for the Miss Georgia Teen USA circuit. "You needed a golden child to parade in front of your bougie country club friends," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal whisper. "And you needed a convenient scapegoat to take the fall for the price tag. You stood in front of the entire congregation and let them pray over my supposedly wicked soul, while you wore the very shoes you bought with stolen tithe money. You sacrificed my reputation to build your perfect superficial empire. Vivian's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. You have always been dramatic, Kendra. I did what I had to do to secure a future for this family. Chloe had potential, and you were just wasting space reading law books in your room. Do not stand here acting high and mighty in a dress you probably rented. I will call security right now and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs for trespassing. Call them, I challenged, stepping closer to her, forcing her back against the hydrangea display. Call Preston Security. Call the local police. Call the mayor, who is currently sipping champagne at table 4. Let us see what happens when you try to forcefully remove me from a public venue. Vivian hesitated, her hand hovering over the small radio earpiece worn by a passing event coordinator. She was a master of reading power dynamics, and something in my absolute lack of fear made her freeze. You are bluffing, she whispered, her voice losing its sharp edge. You are nothing but a bitter woman trying to ruin a beautiful evening because no one is cheering for you. I leaned in so close she could smell my expensive perfume. I didn't steal that money, mother, I said, pronouncing every single syllable with judicial precision. I took the blame when I was a teenager because I had no power to fight back against a corrupt pastor and a status-obsessed mother. But I am not 19 anymore. I am not going to stand there and cry while you lie to save your own skin. I know exactly what you did back then. I know you routed those building funds through a shell vendor account meant for weekly floral arrangements. Vivian swallowed hard, the diamonds on her neck trembling slightly as her breathing grew shallow. She tried to look away, but I held her gaze, trapping her in the reality of her own actions. I let the weight of my words sink deep into her chest before I delivered the final blow. But more importantly, Vivian, I know exactly which offshore account you hid the rest of the embezzled money in last week. Vivian looked as though she had stopped breathing entirely. The blood drained from her flawless face, leaving her custom foundation looking like a pale mask. Before she could stumble through a pathetic lie to defend her hidden offshore account, heavy footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor. Preston marched around the towering hydrangea display, his face flushed with premium champagne and his signature unearned arrogance. He grabbed Vivian by the elbow, pulling her protectively behind him, as if I were the one launching an attack. He glared at my emerald gown, his eyes narrowing as his brain failed to process how the sister he considered a broke failure could look like she owned the entire country club. Preston snapped his fingers loudly, echoing through the grand foyer. Two massive security guards immediately detached themselves from the front entrance and jogged over. Get this trash out of here, Preston barked, pointing a rigid finger at my face. I explicitly told your management to deny entry to anyone not on the donor list. Throw her out right now before she ruins our donors' appetites with her pathetic begging. The two security guards stepped forward, their expressions stoic and intimidating. The lead guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Tyrell, reached out to grab my arm. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply squared my shoulders, raised my chin, and looked Tyrell directly in the eyes. I let the overhead chandelier light catch my face completely. Tyrell stopped dead in his tracks. His heavy hand froze, suspended in the air just inches from my emerald sleeve. Judge Sterling Tyrell asked, his deep voice dropping into a tone of absolute shock and immediate reverence. Good evening, Tyrell, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm and authoritative. How is your daughter doing since the surgery? She is doing wonderful, Your Honor, Tyrell said, quickly pulling his hand back and standing at attention. We are blessed. Thank you for asking. Tyrell knew exactly who I was. 9 months ago, I presided over a massive racketeering case involving the city police and private security union pensions. Corrupt local politicians had tried to gut the retirement funds of thousands of blue-collar workers to finance a downtown stadium project. I issued a permanent injunction that froze the city assets and protected those pensions, holding the corrupt officials in federal contempt. To the working-class men and women in uniform across Atlanta, my courtroom was hallowed ground. Preston's face contorted into an ugly mask of sheer confusion. "What are you doing?" he demanded, shouting at the guards. "I told you to remove her from the premises immediately. My family pays your contracting firm. Grab her and throw her out the front door." Tyrell slowly turned to face my furious brother-in-law. He placed a thick hand on the chest of the second younger guard, silently signaling him to stand down. With all due respect, Sir Tyrell said, his voice completely devoid of the subservience Preston expected. You pay the country club. The club pays my firm. But I respect the law. We are absolutely not putting our hands on a sitting United States federal judge. You will have to ask her to leave yourself. Tyrell and his partner took 2 large steps backward, crossing their arms and completely removing themselves from Preston's command. Preston's jaw dropped. He looked at Vivian, who was still cowering behind him, completely unable to speak. The realization that his generational wealth and his loud demands meant absolutely nothing in the face of my earned authority hit him like a physical blow. He was completely powerless. I did not waste another second looking at them. I turned my back on Preston's sputtering rage and Vivian paralyzed fear, leaving them completely stranded in the lobby. I walked purposefully toward the towering heavy oak double doors that led into the main ballroom. I pushed them open, and the muffled sound of a polite, wealthy crowd suddenly transformed into a clear, booming echo. The ballroom was a masterpiece of exorbitant political spending. Massive crystal chandeliers hung over dozens of round tables draped in crisp white linens and adorned with towering floral centerpieces. The room was packed with the Atlanta bougie elite. Megachurch deacons, wealthy real estate developers, and local politicians were all seated eating their $10,000 plates of filet mignon. They were all completely oblivious to the fact that they were funding a criminal syndicate. At the very front of the room, on a raised stage, bathed in a soft, angelic spotlight, stood my sister. Chloe was gripping the microphone with both hands, wearing a stunning white pantsuit that screamed purity and innocence. She had the entire room eating out of the palm of her hand. I slipped through the heavy doors and stood in the shadows at the back of the room, watching her deliver the performance of a lifetime. It has been a deeply harrowing week for my family, Chloe said, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. She paused, dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue, ensuring she did not smudge her flawless makeup. As many of you saw on the local blogs recently, my older sister is struggling. We are praying diligently for her mental health. It is a heavy, profound burden to watch a loved one spiral out of control. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the wealthy crowd. Several older women in the front row nodded, placing their hands over their hearts in performative solidarity. When my sister took my keys and caused that terrible accident, Chloe continued, her voice cracking with fake devastation. My first thought was not about my campaign. My first thought was about the innocent victim, and about getting my sister the psychiatric help she so desperately needs. Public service requires intense personal sacrifice. It requires us to stand strong in the face of family adversity and continue fighting for the greater good of this beautiful city. The sheer audacity of her lies made my blood run cold. She was using the blood of a federal informant, a man currently fighting for his life in an intensive care unit, to garner sympathy votes and secure illegal campaign donations. She was weaponizing my name to build a firewall around her own felony. I did not scream. I did not cause a chaotic scene. I did not march down the center aisle to rip the microphone from her hands. That is what an unstable person would do, and I was going to give them zero evidence to support their narrative. Instead, I moved like a shadow along the velvet-draped back wall of the grand ballroom, keeping my emerald gown out of the direct stage lights. I headed straight for the elevated audiovisual control booth, located in the far back corner. The soundboard technician was a young college-aged kid wearing a black headset. He was busy adjusting the audio sliders for Chloe's microphone, completely unaware of my approach. When I stepped up to his raised platform, he jumped, slightly startled by my sudden appearance. "Ma'am, you cannot be back here," the young technician whispered frantically, pulling one side of his headset off his ear. "This is a restricted area for event staff only. You need to return to your table before my manager sees you." I did not argue with him. I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out my heavy leather credential case. I flipped it open and placed it flat on his mixing board, letting the glowing LED lights of his monitors illuminate the solid gold federal seal. The kid looked down at the badge, his eyes stretching wide in absolute terror as he read the words, "United States District Court." He swallowed hard, looking back up at me with a deer-in-headlights expression. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. My federal clerk Jamal had prepared it for me specifically for this exact moment. It contained the raw, unedited dashcam photo extracted directly from Chloe wrecked Range Rover. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the mixing board. I looked the terrified young technician directly in his eyes, keeping my voice deadly quiet and completely stripped of emotion. "I need you to bypass whatever slideshow is currently queued up," I said, handing him the silver drive. "You are going to plug this into your primary system, and you are going to play the single image file on that drive onto the main screen behind the candidate. You are going to do it right now." The technician did not hesitate for a single second. He snatched the USB drive from my hand with trembling fingers and immediately plugged it into the master console. The massive digital wall behind my sister flickered for a fraction of a second. Chloe was mid-sentence, wiping a dry eye and talking about the heavy burden of family tragedy. The soaring orchestral music that Preston had carefully selected to play underneath her speech abruptly cut out. The brilliant blue and gold campaign logo reading Chloe Sterling for Atlanta City Council vanished. In its place, a crisp, high-definition image filled the 50-foot screen. The sheer scale of it made the truth absolutely unavoidable. It was a still frame pulled directly from the wrecked Range Rover dashboard camera. The timestamp, glowing bright red in the bottom right corner, matched the exact minute of the collision. There was my sister sitting squarely in the driver's seat. She was not in the passenger seat as she had tearfully claimed to the police. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel. Her face was contorted in sheer drunken panic, illuminated by the harsh glow of the dashboard lights. And most damning of all, her right hand was clutching a half-empty crystal champagne flute just inches from her face. The transition was so abrupt that for 3 agonizing seconds, the entire ballroom was completely silent. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were paralyzed, trying to process the towering 50-foot confession staring down at them. Then the reality of the image hit the crowd like a shockwave. Pandemonium erupted. The distinguished deacons from my father megachurch men, who had just written 5-figure checks based on Chloe false testimony, choked on their expensive filet mignon. Forks clattered loudly against fine china. The powerful real estate developers sitting at the front tables, the men who relied on Preston family money, started frantically whispering to their lawyers and reaching for their coats. But the real chaos came from the back of the room. Preston had invited every major news outlet in the city to document his wife's triumphant return to the campaign trail. He had wanted maximum exposure, and I had just given it to him. Dozens of camera flashes suddenly went off like a strobe light storm, blinding everyone in the front rows. Reporters shoved past the heavy velvet ropes, shouting questions over the rising roar of the crowd. Chloe, completely unaware of what was happening behind her, kept her practiced, tragic smile pasted on her face for a few more seconds. She looked confused by the flashes. Then she slowly turned around. When Chloe saw her own terrified, drunken face towering 50 feet above her, she let out a piercing shriek. She dropped the microphone. It hit the polished wooden stage floor with a deafening thud, sending a horrible screech of audio feedback echoing through the grand ballroom. Guests covered their ears. Chloe covered her face and fell to her knees, her pristine white pantsuit crumpling onto the stage. I stood in the sound booth looking down at the absolute destruction of their fake empire. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched justice take its natural course. Then I heard the heavy thud of footsteps charging up the metal stairs to the control booth. Preston tore through the black curtains separating the booth from the main floor. The arrogant, polished political strategist was completely gone. His face was a violent shade of purple, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his tight silk collar. His eyes locked onto my emerald green gown. He lunged forward and grabbed my arm with brutal, forceful speed. His fingers dug deeply into my bicep, bruising the skin. A normal person would have screamed or fought back. I did neither. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, and then looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. I memorized the exact pressure of his grip, filing it away under a federal assault charge. Preston did not care who saw him. He was operating on pure adrenaline and sheer panic. He yanked me hard, dragging me out of the control booth and down the back stairwell. "Get moving, you psychotic piece of trash," he snarled, his voice shaking with a terrifying lack of control. I let him pull me down the stairs because he was taking us exactly where I needed him to go. We stumbled through the dimly lit service corridor, away from the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters. Jeremiah and Vivian had seen Preston grab me and were rushing down the hallway right behind us. My mother was hyperventilating, her heavy diamond necklace swinging wildly against her chest. My father was barking orders into his cell phone, trying frantically to get his crisis management team on the line. Preston shoved me through a set of heavy mahogany double doors into the VIP green room located just off the side of the main stage. The room was soundproofed, designed to give politicians a quiet place to prepare before facing the crowd. The moment my father and mother crossed the threshold, Preston slammed the heavy doors shut. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the sudden oppressive silence. We were completely sealed off from the chaos outside. The muffled sounds of the panicked ballroom faded away, leaving only the heavy, ragged breathing of my family. Vivian collapsed onto a plush leather sofa, burying her face in her hands. The church, she sobbed, her voice muffled by her shaking fingers. The congregation saw that picture. The board of elders is out there right now. We are ruined, Jeremiah. We are completely ruined. My father ignored her, pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug like a trapped animal. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his pastoral composure entirely shattered. "You have destroyed your own blood," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You brought the devil into this family, Kendra. You just killed your sister's political career." I smoothed the sleeve of my emerald gown, exactly where Preston had grabbed me. "I did not destroy anything, Dad," I said, my voice dropping the temperature in the room. "Chloe destroyed her own career the moment she decided to drink and drive. You destroyed this family the moment you tried to frame me for it. I simply provided the visual evidence." Preston marched across the room, closing the distance between us until he was standing inches from my face. The smell of expensive liquor and cold sweat radiated off his suit. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, along with a heavy gold fountain pen. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely uncap the pen, but the sheer arrogance of his generational wealth kept him moving. "You think you are so smart?" Preston hissed, his blue eyes wide and unhinged. "You think a single picture on a screen changes anything in this city? I own the judges. I own the prosecutors. My family practically built the courthouse you work in." He slapped the checkbook down onto the glass coffee table and aggressively scribbled his signature across the bottom line, leaving the amount blank. He ripped the check from the binding and shoved it directly into my chest. "I will give you $2 million right now." Preston sneered, his voice dropping into a deadly serious whisper. "You are going to walk out those doors, find the nearest camera, and confess to the media. You will tell them you hacked that screen and fabricated that photo because you are a deeply disturbed, jealous woman. You will resign from whatever miserable bench you sit on by morning, and you will take the absolute fall for this entire incident." I let the blank check flutter from my chest and fall onto the floor, landing right next to my designer heels. I looked at him, my expression completely devoid of any fear or hesitation. "And if I decline your generous offer, Preston?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. Preston stepped even closer, invading my space completely. The mask was entirely off. He was no longer a political manager or a wealthy heir. He was a desperate, cornered criminal willing to do whatever it took to protect his freedom. "If you do not," Preston whispered, every word dripping with lethal intent, "I will make sure you do not live to see tomorrow. I have the money to make you disappear. Kendra and the police connections to ensure nobody ever looks for you. Take the money and confess, or I will bury you so deep they will never find your body." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of response to Preston and his death threat. I simply stood there in the center of that soundproof VIP room, letting the heavy, oppressive silence stretch out and swallow them whole. The blank check remained exactly where it had landed by the toe of my designer heel. I knew from years of presiding over a federal courtroom that silence is the absolute sharpest weapon you can wield against the guilty. When you refuse to speak, desperate people will rush to fill the void. They will keep talking until they hang themselves. And I was wearing a diamond brooch that was currently transmitting every single syllable to an armored command vehicle parked 3 blocks away. The quiet in the room became thick and suffocating. Preston's breathing was ragged and shallow. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for my life or negotiate the price of my soul. My complete lack of fear was causing his arrogant brain to short-circuit. He took half a step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward my father. Jeremiah could not handle the silence. He was a man who commanded massive arenas and dictated the spiritual lives of thousands. Being ignored by the daughter he considered worthless was driving him to the edge of absolute madness. He marched across the Persian rug and shoved Preston aside, stepping directly into my line of sight. "You think this is a game, Kendra?" my father shouted, his deep chest rattling with unrestrained fury. "You think you can just stand there and judge us? You have absolutely no idea the magnitude of what is happening right now. You do not comprehend the sheer scale of what I have built for this family, or what I have done to protect it." I kept my face perfectly still, giving him absolutely nothing. My silence fueled his rage exactly as I intended. "I have moved mountains to secure this city council seat for your sister Jeremiah," bellowed, spit flying from his lips and dotting his expensive silk tie. "I took over $500,000 straight from the Global Mission Fund of our church. I washed every single penny of it through 3 different offshore holding companies, just to finance Preston Public Relations firm and buy up every billboard in Atlanta. I broke federal tax laws to guarantee this family a seat at the political table. And you want to throw it all away because you have some pathetic moral objection to a car accident." I was breathing heavily now, his eyes wild with the intoxicating thrill of his own perceived power. He genuinely believed that revealing the depth of his corruption would intimidate me. He thought the scale of his crimes made him untouchable. "Do you know what I did tonight while you were busy playing dress-up in that green gown?" Jeremiah demanded, jabbing his finger toward my chest. "When that boy was bleeding on the asphalt, I did not just wipe down the steering wheel. I personally called the county emergency dispatch supervisor. I have known him for 20 years. I handed him $10,000 in untraceable cash in a duffel bag to deliberately reroute the ambulance. I paid him to send the medics to the wrong intersection so that activist would bleed out and die before he could ever speak to the federal authorities. I committed murder for this family, Kendra. I did that to protect our bloodline. What have you ever done for us?" I cataloged his words with cold clinical precision. Conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, money laundering, wire fraud. He was handing the federal prosecutors a signed confession on a silver platter. My mother Vivian immediately stepped up right beside him, entirely eager to claim her share of the wicked glory. She thought my father's speech was a brilliant display of loyalty. She wanted to prove that she was just as ruthless, just as committed to their toxic empire. "And I staged the entire scene," Vivian announced, her voice shrill and trembling with perverse pride. "When that man went flying over the hood of the Range Rover, I was the one who pulled Chloe out of the driver's seat. I was the one who grabbed your trench coat and tried to force you behind the wheel. When you refused, I wiped the champagne off the dashboard. I hid the empty bottles in the storm drain. I orchestrated the entire cover-up to save my daughter while you stood there doing absolutely nothing. You are the only person in this room refusing to play your part." I looked at Vivian, feeling a profound and hollow sadness for the woman who had brought me into this world. She had traded her soul for country club invitations and front-row seats at political galas. She was bragging about destroying an innocent man's life as if it were a badge of honor. The gravity of their confessions suddenly seemed to shatter the remaining delusions in the room. Chloe had been sitting on the leather sofa, hugging her knees to her chest, but now she scrambled to her feet. The alcohol in her system was warring with pure primal terror. She looked at our parents, and then she looked at Preston. The realization that they were all confessing to massive federal felonies in a desperate bid to intimidate me finally broke through her golden child entitlement. She realized that if I did not take the fall, they were all going to prison. And Chloe was incapable of taking responsibility for anything. She needed a new scapegoat. "It was his fault!" Chloe shrieked suddenly, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at her husband. Preston caused the crash. Preston whipped his head around, staring at his wife in sheer disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snarled. "I was completely drunk!" Chloe yelled hysterically, backing away from him and pressing herself against the mahogany wall. "We were arguing about the zoning permits. He was screaming at me because I told him I did not want to approve the demolition of the South Side housing projects. He leaned over the center console and yanked the steering wheel. He pulled the wheel right when that man was crossing the street. It is his fault. I am the candidate. You have to take the blame, Preston. You have the family money to get out of it. I cannot go to jail. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. In the span of 5 seconds, Chloe had thrown the man she supposedly loved directly into the line of fire to save her own skin. Preston's face drained of all color before flooding with a violent, terrifying shade of crimson. The polished political strategist completely vanished. The wealthy Southern gentleman evaporated. What remained was the raw, ugly reality of a man who viewed everyone around him as property. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides. Before anyone could react, Preston raised his hand and struck Chloe across the face with devastating force. The sharp, sickening crack of his palm against her cheekbone echoed off the soundproof walls. Chloe cried out in shock and pain, collapsing hard onto the polished hardwood floor. Her pristine white pantsuit tangled around her legs as she held her face, staring up at her husband in absolute horror. "You stupid, pathetic little girl," Preston roared, standing over her with his fists clenched at his sides. My father and mother gasped, but neither of them moved a single muscle to help their favorite daughter. They stayed firmly rooted to their spots, entirely paralyzed by their fear of Preston wealth. "Do you honestly think you are the genius behind this campaign?" Preston spat, kicking the edge of Chloe's designer shoe. "Do you think anyone in this city actually cares about your ridiculous speeches or your fake smile? You are nothing but a diversity prop." My family needed a beautiful, acceptable black face to push through our commercial zoning permits in minority neighborhoods. We needed a puppet that the community would trust so we could buy up their land for pennies. Chloe sobbed openly, crawling backward away from him. "My family money bought your wardrobe." Preston continued, his voice dripping with venomous racial superiority that he no longer cared to hide. "My family money bought your megachurch endorsements. I bought your entire existence. You are an empty vessel that I filled with my resources. Without me, you are just another ignorant girl from a fake holy family. Do not ever think you can point a finger at me. I own you. I own your father. I own this entire pathetic room." Preston turned his furious gaze back toward me, breathing heavily like a wild animal. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "And you are going to pick up that check right now. You are going to walk out those doors, and you are going to tell the press that you are a deranged, jealous sister who hacked that screen. If you do not, I swear to God, I will bury this entire family so deep in the ground you will never see daylight again." I looked down at the blank check resting near my heel, then up into Preston's bloodshot eyes. He had just threatened to murder a federal judge in a locked room. He was panting, completely convinced that his generational wealth shielded him from the gravity of his own words. But before I could deliver the final blow to his ego, the true sickness of my family infected the room. My mother, the esteemed First Lady of the Sterling Empire, did not rush to her golden child lying bruised on the hardwood floor. She did not raise a hand to the man who had just violently struck her daughter. Instead, Vivian scrambled past Chloe, her heavy diamond necklace catching the dim light, and placed her manicured hands pleadingly on Preston's jacket lapels. "Preston, please," Vivian begged, her voice high and breathless with panic. She didn't mean it. "Chloe is just hysterical from the accident. You know how she gets when she drinks too much. Please do not pull the funding. We have the mayor coming to the house next week." I watched in absolute disgust as my mother prioritized a campaign check over her own flesh and blood. She turned her furious gaze down to Chloe, who was holding her rapidly swelling cheek, staring up at the woman who had birthed her in complete disbelief. "Get up off the floor and apologize to your husband right now," Vivian hissed, pointing a sharp acrylic nail at Chloe. "Do you want to ruin everything we have built? Do not ruin the funding, Chloe. He is right. You are nothing without his family's connections. You need him. Now apologize." My father stepped forward, aligning himself perfectly with his wife and his wealthy son-in-law. Jeremiah towered over his favorite daughter, the very same daughter he had been grooming for political stardom since she was a teenager. "Listen to your mother," Jeremiah commanded, his pastoral voice dripping with cold disappointment. "You are embarrassing yourself. Preston's family is putting millions into this election and into my church expansion. You will not jeopardize our legacy because you cannot handle your liquor or your temper." Apologize to Preston, and then we will deal with your sister. The golden child illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the Persian rug. I watched the exact moment Chloe realized the horrifying truth of her existence. For 32 years she had mocked me, belittled me, and paraded her favored status in my face. She honestly believed our parents loved her more because she was better, smarter, and more beautiful. But sitting on that floor with a handprint burning into her cheek, Chloe finally understood that she was never a daughter to them. She was a commodity. She was an investment vehicle designed to yield social currency and political power. The moment her actions threatened their bottom line, they threw her to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. They were willing to let a man abuse her right in front of them as long as the checks kept clearing. She was just as disposable to them as I was. Chloe lowered her hand from her face. The fake tears she had been crying all night were completely gone, replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a woman whose entire universe had just collapsed. She looked at our parents, then she looked at me. For the first time in our lives, we were standing on the exact same ground. Preston straightened his jacket, emboldened by my parents' pathetic groveling. He looked down his nose at me, a smug, victorious sneer returning to his flushed face. "You see that, Kendra," he mocked. "Even your own parents know how the world actually works. Now pick up that check, write whatever number makes you feel better about your miserable life, and get out there to face the press." I slowly reached down and picked up the check from the floor. I held the crisp, expensive paper between my fingers. Preston smirked, assuming I had finally broken, assuming that money had won just like it always did in his world. I ripped the check straight down the middle. Preston's smirk vanished instantly. I tore the paper again, and then a third time, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto his expensive Italian loafers. "I do not need $2 million. Preston?" I said, my voice echoing with the absolute uncompromising authority of a federal courtroom. "My annual salary is a matter of public record which you clearly never bothered to look up. But the federal budget I oversee for this district is $400 million. I direct the flow of justice across this entire city, and unlike you, I did not inherit a single dime of my power. I earned it." Preston took a step back, the alcohol-fueled confidence finally cracking as the terrifying reality of my position began to penetrate his thick skull. "You people thought you could lock me in a room and bully me into submission." I continued, stepping toward him, forcing him to retreat. "You thought because I am a black woman who refused to worship at the altar of your country club status, I was weak. But you forgot one crucial detail about my job." I reached up and gently tapped the sparkling diamond brooch pinned to the asymmetrical neckline of my emerald gown. The piece of jewelry caught the light beautifully, but its true value was hidden deep inside the casing. "Federal judges do not typically attend campaign galas uninvited." I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "And they certainly do not walk into hostile environments without bringing their jurisdiction with them. By the way, threatening to assassinate a federal judge while actively confessing to money laundering, obstruction of justice, and voter fraud on a live FBI wire transmitter is a remarkably bold campaign strategy." The silence that hit the room this time was absolute and terrifying. Jeremiah grabbed his chest, stumbling backward until he hit the mahogany wall. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Preston went completely rigid, his eyes locked on the diamond brooch like it was a loaded weapon pointed squarely at his head. "You're lying," Preston whispered, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "You are bluffing. There is no wire." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached certainty of a judge who had just sentenced a guilty man to a very long time behind bars. "I never bluff," I replied. I reached into the pocket of my gown and pulled out my cell phone. I pressed a single button on the screen. I did not need to make a call. I did not need to say a word. The signal had been sent. "You might want to step away from the door," I advised them, taking a calculated step back toward the center of the room. The federal government does not knock. The heavy mahogany doors did not just open. They absolutely exploded inward. The deafening crack of a tactical battering ram, shattering the reinforced wood, echoed like a bomb detonating inside the VIP room. Splinters of expensive polished mahogany rained down across the Persian rug, scattering over the shredded pieces of Preston's $2 million check. Before my father could even draw a breath to scream, a dozen federal agents swarmed the confined space. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, their dark tactical gear creating a jarring, violent contrast against the crystal chandeliers and silk wallpaper. FBI, nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them. The commanding shout came from Lead Agent Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered black man who radiated absolute, uncompromising authority. He stepped through the ruined doorway with his weapon drawn and his badge prominently displayed, his eyes instantly scanning the room and assessing every threat. For a fraction of a second, the sheer kinetic violence of the breach completely paralyzed my family. They were people who lived their entire lives insulated by wealth-gated communities and private security. They had never experienced the blunt, unforgiving force of the federal justice system crashing directly into their personal space. Preston was the first to react, and his response was entirely dictated by his toxic, unearned generational arrogance. He actually believed his white privilege and his family name functioned as a bulletproof shield. He lunged forward, raising his hands not in surrender, but in aggressive indignation, attempting to shove his way past a heavily armed federal agent. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Preston bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. "You are trespassing on private property. I am going to have every single one of your badges stripped by morning. Get your hands off me." Agent Carter did not hesitate. He did not care about Preston's trust fund, his political connections, or his custom-tailored tuxedo. Carter grabbed Preston by the lapels of his expensive jacket, spun him around with effortless brute strength, and slammed him face first into the pristine mahogany wall. The impact knocked the wind completely out of Preston. Before my brother-in-law could even gasp for air, Carter swept Preston's legs apart, pinned his arms sharply behind his back, and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the restraints locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had heard all night. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and witness tampering," Agent Carter stated, his voice a low, rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Vivian let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. My mother, the fiercely proud First Lady of the sterling megachurch empire, watched the illusion of her untouchable social status shatter in real time. As two female agents approached her with handcuffs ready, Vivian frantically backed away, clutching her heavy diamond necklace as if the jewelry could magically protect her from federal indictment. "Do not touch me!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with sheer terror and supreme indignation. "I am the wife of Bishop Jeremiah Sterling. We host the mayor at our estate. We are hosting a charity gala right outside those doors. You are ruining my dress. You cannot do this to us. We are respectable people." The agents ignored her frantic protests entirely. They grabbed her arms expertly, securing her wrists behind her back. Vivian sobbed wildly, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as the cold steel bit into her skin. Jeremiah attempted to weaponize his pastoral authority one last time. He puffed out his chest and raised his hands, trying to project the booming, charismatic presence he used to command his congregation. "Gentlemen, there has been a terrible misunderstanding here," my father declared, his voice trembling, despite his desperate attempt to sound commanding. "I am a man of God. We are pillars of the Atlanta community. If you just allow me to make one phone call to the governor, we can clear this entire situation up without creating a public spectacle." A seasoned agent stepped right into my father's personal space, completely immune to the megachurch performance. "Bishop Sterling," the agent said coldly, snapping the handcuffs tightly onto my father's wrists. "God is not presiding over your case tonight. The federal government is. You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement of nonprofit funds, and obstruction of justice. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Chloe was still sitting on the floor where Preston had struck her. She did not fight. She did not scream. The golden child was completely broken. An agent gently but firmly pulled her up by her arms, securing her wrists. Chloe just stared blankly at the shredded pieces of mahogany on the floor, the bruising on her cheek already turning a dark, angry purple. Her entire life, her political campaign, and her marriage had just evaporated in the span of 5 minutes. Through the shattered doorway of the VIP room, the absolute magnitude of their public destruction became visible. The flashing red and blue lights of Federal Command vehicles illuminated the grand windows of the country club. The main ballroom, which just moments ago had been filled with wealthy donors sipping champagne, was now a scene of absolute chaos. The elite members of Atlanta high society were gathered just outside the broken doors, craning their necks to witness the spectacle. The mega-church deacons who had faithfully funded my father's empire were staring in pure, unadulterated horror as their beloved bishop and first lady were paraded out in steel chains. The reporters Preston had so eagerly invited to document Chloe's triumph were now swarming the velvet ropes, their camera flashes exploding in a blinding, relentless wave. My family was not just being arrested. They were being publicly, utterly destroyed in front of the exact people they had sacrificed my mental health and my reputation to impress. I stood quietly in the center of the room, smoothing the asymmetrical neckline of my emerald green gown. I had not moved an inch during the entire raid. I simply watched the justice system operate with the cold mechanical efficiency I had dedicated my entire life to upholding. Agent Carter turned to me, giving a brief, respectful nod. "We have the perimeter secured, Your Honor. The command center has confirmed clear reception of the wiretap transmission. We have their full uncoerced confessions captured on crystal-clear audio." "Thank you, Agent Carter," I replied, my voice projecting calm authority. "Process the defendants and secure them in federal holding." As the agents began forcefully marching my family out of the room toward the blinding storm of media cameras, Preston suddenly stopped. He dug his heels into the Persian rug, forcing the agents to halt for a fraction of a second. Even in handcuffs, facing decades in federal prison, his toxic delusional arrogance refused to die. Preston twisted his head to look back at me. His face was bruised from being shoved into the wall, but his lips curled into a vicious, mocking sneer. "You think you won," Kendra Preston spat, his voice dripping with pure aristocratic venom. "You think this little tactical raid actually means anything in this city? You are just a judge. My family owns the entire system. You can parade us out of here for the cameras, but my lawyers will have me walking out of the federal building by midnight." He let out a harsh, arrogant laugh that echoed over the sound of the camera flashes outside. "The magistrate judge who handles late-night arraignments is on my family payroll." Preston bragged, completely unbothered by the federal agents gripping his arms. "We funded his election. We bought his vacation home. He will grant me a signature bond before I even have to trade this tuxedo for an orange jumpsuit. You played yourself, sweetheart. You threw your own family to the wolves, and it is not even going to stick. I will be sleeping in my own bed tonight, and tomorrow I am coming for your badge." I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger, fear, or intimidation. I looked at the man who had terrorized my sister, threatened my life, and treated the law like a personal playground. I looked at my mother and father, who were staring at Preston with desperate, pathetic hope, praying that his dirty money would save them from the consequences of their own actions. I stepped forward, the emerald silk of my gown catching the harsh, tactical lights of the room. I looked directly into Preston's arrogant, bloodshot eyes with absolute zero emotion. "Are you sure about that?" I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my judicial chambers, staring at the closed-circuit monitor on my massive mahogany desk. The high-definition camera mounted above the jury box provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the federal courtroom. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. Less than 12 hours ago, my family was draped in diamonds and custom silk, sipping $10,000 champagne while actively orchestrating a violent criminal cover-up. Now they were sitting in the defendant box of my courtroom wearing standard-issue oversized orange canvas jumpsuits. The visual contrast was absolute poetry. The federal justice system is the ultimate equalizer. It strips away your exclusive country club memberships, your luxury vehicles, and your designer labels, the very second those heavy steel doors lock behind you. I watched my mother Vivian adjusting her bright orange collar with trembling hands. Without her team of professional stylists and her expensive foundation, she looked entirely stripped of her untouchable megachurch First Lady armor. Spending the night in a cold federal holding cell had completely ruined her silk-pressed hair. The harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom highlighted every single line of stress and sheer panic on her face. I could see her lips moving rapidly as she complained to the federal marshal standing directly behind her. Even without the audio feed engaged, I knew exactly what she was saying. She was holding her wrists up indignantly, whining about how the heavy steel handcuffs were chafing her sensitive skin and ruining her joints. She was probably demanding to speak to a facility manager, as if the United States Marshals Service operated like the concierge desk at the Buckhead Heritage Club. Her delusion was simply staggering. She was facing 30 years for money laundering and conspiracy, but her immediate overriding concern was the state of her cuticles and her public image. Beside her, my father, Jeremiah, was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He had positioned himself as close to the wooden railing of the defendant box as physically possible, angling his body toward the packed gallery. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity with local political reporters, federal clerks, and a few utterly shocked deacons from our congregation who had shown up to support their disgraced leader. Jeremiah had his head thrown back and his handcuffed hands clasped together in fervent theatrical prayer. His deep baritone voice carried through the high ceilings of the courtroom. He was praying loudly, asking the Lord to forgive the wicked secular forces that had conspired to tear down their righteous empire. He was playing the persecuted martyr to absolute perfection, attempting to use the federal courthouse as a makeshift Sunday pulpit. He honestly believed his immense spiritual charisma could somehow overpower a federal indictment. Next to him sat my sister Chloe. The golden child was entirely unrecognizable. She sat slumped on the hard wooden bench, staring blankly at the polished floor. Her pristine white campaign pantsuit had been confiscated during booking, replaced by the harsh, stiff orange fabric that swallowed her small frame. Without her heavy television makeup, the dark, angry bruise on her cheekbone where Preston had violently struck her last night was fully visible to the entire courtroom. She was trembling slightly, completely isolated and broken. Neither of our parents offered her a single word of comfort. They were too busy focusing on their own survival and their public perception to care about the daughter they had commodified and sold for political power. On the far end of the bench sat Preston. Even in a jail-issued jumpsuit, my white brother-in-law radiated a toxic, unearned arrogance. I was leaning over the railing, whispering intensely with his newly retained high-priced defense attorney. The lawyer was a slick, fast-talking partner from one of Atlanta's most expensive corporate firms, a man accustomed to making white-collar crimes magically disappear before they ever reached a docket. The attorney wore a smug, self-satisfied grin. He kept checking his expensive gold watch and patting Preston on the shoulder, projecting complete and utter confidence to the gallery behind them. I reached forward and turned up the volume on the closed-circuit audio feed, capturing their hushed conversation through the highly sensitive courtroom microphones. The defense attorney leaned close to Preston and my father, speaking with absolute certainty. "Relax, Bishop," the lawyer whispered smoothly, keeping his eyes on the empty judge bench. "We drew Judge Carmichael for the morning arraignment rotation. We are in perfect shape. Preston's father bought Carmichael his vacation home on Lake Oconee 3 years ago. The campaign contributions are fully documented in the dark money political action committees. Carmichael knows exactly who feeds him. You are in safe hands today." Preston let out a harsh, arrogant laugh that scraped against the quiet tension of the room. "I told you we were untouchable," Preston sneered, leaning back against the hard wooden bench and looking down his nose at Chloe. "You hear that, you pathetic little mess? We are walking out those front doors in 10 minutes. Carmichael will slap us with a signature bond claim. The FBI overstepped their jurisdictional authority with that raid last night, and we will be eating brunch at the club by 11. I am going to have that arrogant federal bitch Kendra investigated and disbarred before the sun goes down today." I listened to my brother-in-law threaten my career while actively bragging about bribing a federal judge on a recorded court microphone. His generational wealth had completely insulated him from reality for so long that he could no longer recognize when he was walking directly into a trap. He was so blinded by his privilege he did not realize the federal government was already 10 steps ahead of him. I reached across my desk and picked up my heavy black judicial robe. I slipped my arms into the thick fabric, feeling the familiar comforting weight of it settle over my shoulders. I fastened the hidden zipper, ensuring the robe hung perfectly straight over my conservative black dress. I did not wear flashy jewelry or designer labels today. The robe was the absolute only statement I needed to make. I stepped out of my private chambers and walked down the narrow carpeted hallway that led directly to the elevated bench. My senior federal clerk Jamal was waiting for me by the heavy oak door holding a thick stack of case files. Jamal looked at me, his eyes wide with high-stakes anticipation and intense focus. "The prosecution team is ready, Your Honor," Jamal whispered, handing me the heavy folders. "The FBI lead agent is sitting in the front row of the gallery. The room is at absolute maximum capacity. The press is practically climbing over the wooden barriers." I nodded, taking the heavy files and adjusting my grip. "Is the defense counsel still operating under the assumption that Judge Carmichael is presiding?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and measured. Jamal smiled a sharp, knowing grin. "Yes, Your Honor. Judge Carmichael suddenly came down with a severe and highly convenient case of the flu at 6 this morning, right after the appellate court authorized your emergency substitution. The defense team has absolutely no idea you are taking the bench today. They are walking in completely blind." I placed my hand on the cool brass doorknob of the private judicial entrance. The low buzzing murmur of the packed courtroom filtered through the thick mahogany wood. I could hear Preston bragging loudly to his attorney about the steak he planned to order for lunch to celebrate his release. I could hear my mother Vivian complaining bitterly about the drafty air conditioning ruining her skin. I could hear my father Jeremiah reciting his performative scriptures for the journalists seated in the back row. They were sitting in my house playing by their corrupt rules, completely unaware that the game was already over. They thought their money and their status made them gods in this city. They were about to learn that in this specific room I was the only authority that mattered. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy oak door open. The seasoned federal bailiff stood at strict military attention at the front of the room. The moment my black robe crossed the threshold, his booming, authoritative voice cut through the chaotic noise of the courtroom like a sharp crack of thunder, instantly silencing every single person in the gallery. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Kendra Sterling." I stepped through the heavy oak door leading to the elevated bench. The thick black fabric of my judicial robe brushed against the polished wood, the only sound accompanying the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels. The entire courtroom scrambled to their feet. The rustle of hundreds of people standing at attention filled the cavernous space. For 34 years, my family had made me feel incredibly small. They had forced me to shrink, to apologize for my existence, to sit in the shadows while they paraded in the spotlight. But the geography of a federal courtroom is designed to establish absolute authority. The bench is raised high above the gallery, high above the defense tables, high above the gallery of spectators. As I ascended the short flight of stairs and took my place behind the massive mahogany desk, I did not just take a seat. I took control of my entire universe. I remained standing for a brief moment, letting my eyes sweep across the packed room. The gallery was overflowing with local reporters, federal clerks, and several deeply bewildered deacons from my father's megachurch who had shown up expecting a swift, corrupt dismissal. They were all holding their collective breath. I slowly lowered myself into the high-backed leather chair. I arranged my digital tablet and the thick manila case files seamlessly on the desk in front of me. Only then did I look directly down into the defendant's box. The visual impact of my family, sitting in the prisoner holding area, was staggering. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the federal building stripped away every single ounce of their curated glamour. They were no longer the untouchable black elite of Atlanta. They were federal inmates awaiting arraignment. And the moment they looked up and saw my face beneath the Great Seal of the United States, the reality of their destruction hit them like a freight train. Vivian lost all ability to breathe. My mother, the woman who had spent decades meticulously crafting her image for high society galas, the woman who had slapped me in the freezing rain and demanded I take the fall for a violent felony, physically recoiled. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Her hands, still locked in heavy steel handcuffs, began to shake so violently that the metal chains rattled against the wooden partition. She looked at my face, then at the black robe wrapping my shoulders, and her mouth opened and closed, without producing a single sound. The supreme delusion that I was just a downtown paper pusher evaporated instantly. She was looking at the apex of the federal justice system, and she finally realized she had been terrorizing a titan. Next to her, Jeremiah completely abandoned his pastoral performance. My father had spent the entire morning praying loudly and performing for the journalists in the back rows, absolutely certain that his megachurch empire and his political connections made him invincible. But looking up at the bench, the arrogant commanding bishop shriveled into a terrified aging man. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The spiritual authority he wielded over 10,000 devoted followers meant absolutely nothing in this room. He could not preach his way out of a federal indictment, and he could not bribe the woman sitting on the bench. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in rapid, jerky motions as if trying to wake up from a living nightmare. Chloe simply broke. The golden child, the perfect political candidate, who had been willing to let an innocent man die on the asphalt to protect her poll numbers, covered her mouth with both of her handcuffed hands to stifle a loud, ugly sob. She stared up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. She was wearing a stiff, oversized orange canvas jumpsuit that swallowed her small frame, a jarring contrast to the tailored white pantsuit she had worn on stage the night before. She looked at the sister she had mocked, the sister she had deemed a pathetic failure, and recognized that her literal freedom now rested entirely in my hands. But the most profound reaction came from the man sitting at the defense table. Preston's high-powered corporate attorney, the slick lawyer who had confidently promised them a 10-minute signature bond and a brunch reservation, looked like he had just been struck by lightning. He knew exactly who I was. Anyone who practiced law in this district knew Judge Sterling's reputation for uncompromising lethal precision. The attorney's smug self-satisfied grin vanished instantly. The expensive gold pen he had been twirling between his fingers slipped from his grasp. It hit the solid oak defense table with a sharp, echoing clatter, rolling off the edge and dropping onto the carpet. The lawyer slowly turned his head to look at Preston, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and furious betrayal. He realized in a fraction of a second that his wealthy, arrogant client had not just lied to him about the nature of the charges, but had somehow managed to drag him into a courtroom presided over by the one judge in the entire state they could not bully or manipulate. The lawyer immediately took 2 large steps away from Preston, physically distancing himself from the radioactive hazard his client had become. He quickly lowered his head, staring intently at his blank legal pad, refusing to make eye contact with the bench. He was already calculating how fast he could formally withdraw his counsel before his own career went down in flames. Preston, however, was fundamentally incapable of reading the room. His white privilege and his generational entitlement completely overrode whatever basic survival instincts he might have possessed. He simply could not process the image of a black woman, specifically his sister-in-law, holding absolute unchecked authority over his life. To Preston, power was something you bought, inherited, or stole. The idea that I had earned the right to send him to federal prison was a glitch in his toxic reality. The shock on his face rapidly mutated into reckless, explosive rage. He ignored his defense attorney's frantic, hushed whispers to remain seated. He ignored the 2 armed federal marshals stepping aggressively toward the defendant's box. Preston shoved his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He jumped to his feet, his orange jumpsuit bunching awkwardly around his shoulders, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. "You have got to be kidding me!" Preston bellowed, his voice echoing loudly and bouncing off the high, vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. He pointed his handcuffed hands directly at the bench, completely unhinged. "This is a setup. This is a complete and total setup." Mr. Preston, his attorney hissed through gritted teeth, desperately grabbing at the fabric of Preston's jumpsuit. "Sit down and shut your mouth immediately." Preston violently yanked his arm away from the lawyer, leaning far over the wooden railing of the defendant's box. He turned his head wildly, shouting to the packed gallery of reporters and spectators trying to commandeer the narrative just like he always did. "Do you see this?" He screamed, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "Do you see what is happening here? She has no jurisdiction over me. My father pays the political action committees that fund this entire district. We were promised Judge Carmichael. We were guaranteed Carmichael this morning. He whipped his head back around to face the bench, glaring up at me with absolute murderous contempt. "You cannot do this," Preston shouted, the veins bulging visibly in his neck. "I demand a recusal right now. I demand new counsel and I demand a new judge. You cannot sit on that bench and judge me. She is my sister-in-law. This is a massive conflict of interest. This is entirely illegal. You are a corrupt, pathetic fraud, and I am going to have you disbarred and thrown in a cell right next to us." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The reporters in the back row began typing furiously on their phones, sensing the explosive magnitude of the scandal unfolding in front of them. The two federal marshals immediately unclipped their radios, stepping up directly behind Preston, fully prepared to physically tackle him to the floor. Vivian let out a soft, terrified wail, shrinking back into the wooden bench as she realized her son-in-law was actively sealing their doom. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, unhinged energy. I simply sat behind the mahogany desk, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely devoid of any emotion. I let his arrogant, ignorant shouting fill the cavernous room, giving him all the rope he needed to hang himself publicly. I waited until he ran out of breath, until his chest was heaving, and the echo of his threats began to fade into the heavy, suffocating tension of the room. I slowly reached my right hand toward the polished wooden sound block resting on my desk. I picked up the heavy wooden gavel. I raised it a few inches in the air, holding it steady for a fraction of a second. I brought the gavel down with devastating, calculated force. The sharp, deafening crack of the wood hitting the sound block echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The sound was so violent and absolute that Preston physically flinched, his shoulders jerking upward as the noise snapped his chaotic rant in half. The frantic whispering in the gallery instantly died. The entire room plunged into absolute terrified silence. "Sit down, Mr. Preston," I said. My voice was low, incredibly calm, and laced with the lethal, uncompromising authority of the United States federal government. "Before you embarrass your attorney further, and before I hold you in summary contempt and add another 5 years to your impending sentence, let me clarify the law for you." The courtroom remained locked in a breathless, heavy silence. Preston stood frozen, his face a canvas of conflicting rage and terror, as his high-priced attorney practically yanked him back down onto the hard wooden bench by the collar of his orange jumpsuit. I looked down at the defense table, letting my gaze sweep over my family before addressing the official court record. The geography of a federal courtroom is designed to establish absolute, unquestionable authority. Sitting behind the massive mahogany bench elevated high above the gallery and the defendants, I was no longer the scapegoat they could manipulate in a locked room. I was the law. For the benefit of the gallery, the press, and the defendants who mistakenly believe they can purchase the federal judiciary, let me state the jurisdictional facts of this morning arraignment. I spoke with absolute clarity, my voice amplified by the microphone and echoing sharply off the wood-paneled walls. Last night, I was not merely a guest at a campaign gala. I was operating as an authorized federal informant in direct coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I saw a row of senior deacons from my father megachurch men who had known me since I was a child physically recoil in their seats. The journalists in the back rows started typing frantically on their devices. Furthermore, I continued silencing the rising murmurs with a single commanding look. Due to credible, documented intelligence indicating that the originally assigned magistrate, Judge Carmichael, had been compromised through illegal financial contributions from the Preston Family Trust, an emergency petition was filed at 4 o'clock this morning. A visiting judge from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the evidence of extreme flight risk, active judicial bribery, and ongoing witness tampering. That appellate judge signed a special order authorizing me to preside over this specific preliminary bail hearing to ensure the immediate, untainted administration of justice. I looked directly at Preston Attorney, a man famous in Atlanta for making white-collar crimes disappear. "Counsel, if you have any objections regarding conflicts of interest, you are welcome to file them with the appellate clerk. But be advised doing so will require you to formally defend your client recorded admission of bribing a federal official." The slick corporate lawyer swallowed hard, refusing to make eye contact with me. He slowly stood up, keeping his hands perfectly flat on the defense table. "The defense has no objections at this time, Your Honor," he stated, his voice completely devoid of all its previous swagger. Preston whipped his head around to stare at his lawyer, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief as he realized his expensive legal shield had just entirely evaporated. He was entirely on his own. I turned my attention to the thick manila folder resting on my desk. I opened it, the crisp sound of the heavy paper turning echoing through the silent room. "Let the record reflect that the prosecution has submitted Exhibit A certified transcript of the audio recording captured in the VIP room of the Buckhead Heritage Country Club at 10:15 last night. My father." Jeremiah squeezed his eyes shut. He began rocking slightly back and forth on the wooden bench, his pastoral facade completely obliterated by the impending exposure of his sins. The man who had spent 30 years cultivating an untouchable image among the black elite of Atlanta was about to be publicly dismantled by his own words. I picked up the transcript. I did not rush. I read their own words back to them with clinical, devastating precision. Defendant Jeremiah Sterling stated, and I quote, "I took over $500,000 straight from the Global Mission Fund of our church. I washed every single penny of it through 3 different offshore holding companies to finance my daughter campaign." Absolute chaos instantly erupted in the gallery. The megachurch members who had sacrificed their hard-earned money to fund those global missions cried out in profound outrage. A well-dressed older woman in the second row began to weep loudly, realizing her faithful tithes had bought designer pantsuits and political advertisements. The federal bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon, restoring order with a stern, heavy glare. I did not pause. I continued reading, my voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room like a scalpel. Defendant Vivian Sterling stated, "I orchestrated the entire cover-up to save my daughter. I wiped the champagne off the dashboard." And Defendant Preston, regarding his intent to silence a federal judge, stated, "I will make sure you do not live to see tomorrow. I will bury you so deep they will never find your body." I set the transcript down. I looked at the 4 people in the defendant box. The sheer magnitude of their own hubris had finally caught up to them. They had spent their entire lives believing their wealth and their elite social standing made them untouchable. They believed the rules did not apply to them because they were the ones who wrote the checks. But the federal record does not care about your zip code or your country club memberships. I picked up my pen. It was a simple standard issue black pen, but in this room it was the most powerful weapon in existence. Based on the overwhelming evidence of conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering, the prosecution has filed emergency motions for asset forfeiture, I announced, pulling the first order toward me. My mother let out a small, terrified whimper. The realization that her entire financial reality was about to vanish finally broke through her denial. "I am signing the order to immediately seize and freeze the 3 offshore accounts associated with Jeremiah Sterling and the Sterling Megachurch Enterprise," I said, signing my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. "Those funds will be held in federal receivership pending a full forensic audit to return the stolen tithes to the congregation." Jeremiah dropped his head into his handcuffed hands, a broken, defeated man watching his life work vanish in a single stroke of ink. The empire he had built on a foundation of lies and exploitation was officially dead. I pulled the second document forward. "Furthermore, I am signing the federal order freezing all assets, bank accounts, and dark money political action committees tied to the Chloe Sterling for Atlanta City Council campaign. All campaign operations are hereby suspended indefinitely due to active violations of federal election law." Chloe let out a gut-wrenching sob. The golden child who had built her entire identity on being the flawless, successful daughter physically collapsed against the wooden railing of the defendant box. Her political career, the very thing she had been willing to let an innocent man die for, was permanently destroyed. The white pantsuits and the fake smiles were gone forever. She was nothing but a federal inmate facing decades in a penitentiary. "And finally," I said, moving to the last stack of papers, "I am authorizing the immediate seizure of all commercial real estate holdings and liquid assets belonging to Preston Family Development Group connected to the illegal bribery of city zoning officials." Preston's face drained of its violent red anger, leaving him looking sickly and completely hollow. His generational wealth, the shield he had used to terrorize my sister, abuse the working-class neighborhoods of Atlanta, and threaten my life, was systematically being dismantled and locked inside a federal vault. I was taking away the only thing that gave him power in this world. The utter totality of their destruction settled over the courtroom. In less than 5 minutes, I had legally dismantled the corrupt empire they had spent 30 years building. I had stripped them of their money, their power, and their false prestige. The arrogant predators who had tormented me for my entire life were now completely powerless. Vivian could no longer maintain the illusion of control. The reality of the cold, sterile prison cell waiting for her completely broke her fragile mind. She lunged forward, her orange canvas jumpsuit pulling tight as she threw her body against the heavy wooden railing of the defendant box. The heavy steel handcuffs binding her wrists clattered violently against the polished wood, echoing through the silent room. "Kendra, please," Vivian screamed, her voice tearing through the courtroom, raw and completely desperate. She was no longer the arrogant, judgmental matriarch looking down at her disappointment of a daughter. She was a terrified criminal begging for mercy from the very woman she had thrown away. "Kendra, look at me. We are your family. You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to your own blood." Vivian's desperate plea echoed off the heavy oak panels of the courtroom. She gripped the wooden rail of the defendant box so hard her knuckles turned stark white under the harsh fluorescent lights. She invoked our blood as if biology was an automatic pass-out of federal custody. I looked down from the elevated bench at the woman who had slapped me in the freezing rain just 48 hours ago. The woman who had proudly confessed to wiping down a crime scene and abandoning an innocent man to bleed out on the asphalt. She expected me to fold. She expected the decades of toxic conditioning, the relentless emotional manipulation that demanded I protect the family image at all costs, to somehow override my sworn oath to the United States Constitution. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the polished mahogany desk. I made sure the microphone captured every single syllable of my response. "This court recognizes no family ties to individuals who operate as a criminal syndicate," I stated, my voice resonating with cold, absolute finality. "You spent your entire life curating a flawless image for the country club and the megachurch. You built an empire on lies and demanded that everyone around you suffer to maintain it. You chose your legacy, Vivian. Now you will serve it." Vivian let out a hollow, ragged gasp and collapsed back onto the hard wooden bench. Her entire body shook as the reality of her shattered socialite existence finally crushed her. She was no longer a powerful matriarch. She was just another federal defendant waiting for processing. I turned my attention to the far end of the box. Preston was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under the bright orange canvas of his inmate jumpsuit. The arrogant political mastermind, who had confidently promised to buy my silence for $2 million, was sweating profusely. His eyes darted toward the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery, searching desperately for a miraculous rescue that was never going to come. His high-priced corporate attorney stood rigidly beside him, maintaining a strict professional distance, completely refusing to advocate for a man who had actively threatened a federal official on a live wiretap. "Regarding the matter of pre-trial release," I announced, picking up the bail determination forms. "The government has filed a motion for pre-trial detention for all 4 defendants. I will address Defendant Preston first." Preston gripped the railing, his knuckles matching my mother's in their pale desperation. "You have to grant me a bond," Preston blurted out, his voice cracking with panic, completely ignoring courtroom protocol. "My father will put up the entire estate. I will surrender my passport. I am not a flight risk." I did not even blink. I stared him down until he was forced to close his mouth and swallow hard. "Mr. Preston," I said, keeping my tone clinically detached, "you were captured on a crystal-clear Federal Bureau of Investigation wiretap explicitly offering a $2 million bribe to a sitting federal judge. When that bribe was refused, you escalated immediately to a violent threat. You stated on the record that you would make sure I did not live to see tomorrow, and that you would bury me so deep nobody would ever find my body." A collective shudder rippled through the packed gallery. The press row scrambled to record the exact phrasing on their digital tablets. Threatening the assassination of a federal judicial officer is a severe felony that strikes at the very foundation of our democratic republic. I continued, my voice rising to command the sheer gravity of the room. It demonstrates a profound and dangerous belief that your wealth places you entirely above the law. Furthermore, you possess vast generational resources, dark money political action committees, and a documented willingness to use lethal force to protect your assets. You represent a clear present and extreme danger to the community and to the integrity of this judicial process. Bail is categorically denied. You will remain in federal custody pending trial. Preston slumped forward, as if I had physically struck him. The last remaining shred of his white privilege evaporated into the sterile courtroom air. He was going back to a concrete cell, and his family money could not unlock the door. I shifted my gaze to my father. Jeremiah was staring blankly at the floor, completely stripped of his booming pastoral charisma. He looked like an empty shell. The congregation members seated in the gallery watched him with expressions of profound betrayal and absolute disgust. He had stolen their faith and their finances to buy political power. Regarding defendants Jeremiah and Vivian Sterling, I stated, picking up the next set of documents. The evidence presented in the preliminary wiretap transcript indicates a highly sophisticated, coordinated effort to launder over $500,000 in stolen nonprofit funds. You utilized a complex network of offshore holding companies to mask your criminal enterprise. You actively conspired to obstruct justice by bribing a county emergency dispatch supervisor, directly resulting in life-threatening delays in medical care for a critically injured federal informant. My father finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one last performative prayer or a desperate apology, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. In this room, he had no voice. Given the international nature of your financial crimes and your demonstrated ability to manipulate local law enforcement through bribery, you represent an unacceptable flight risk. I continued, my pen hovering over the signature line. You have shown a complete disregard for human life in your pursuit of political power. You used your spiritual authority as a weapon of deception. I find that no condition or combination of conditions will reasonably assure your appearance at trial or guarantee the safety of the community. Bail is denied for both defendants. You will remain in federal custody. I signed the final orders, pressing the pen firmly into the heavy paper. The swift mechanical efficiency of the legal process was absolute. In less than 20 minutes, I had completely dismantled a corrupt dynasty that had plagued Atlanta for decades. I stacked the signed documents neatly and handed them to the court clerk. I picked up the heavy wooden gavel. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, bracing for the final impact. I looked at the 4 people in the defendant box. They were bound by steel chains and ruined ambitions. They had traded their humanity for status, and now they had neither. Remand the defendants to federal custody, I ordered. The gavel slammed down onto the sound block. The sharp, explosive crack echoed through the high, vaulted ceilings, ringing with the absolute finality of justice served. Immediately, a dozen armed United States Marshals stepped forward, moving with crisp, synchronized precision. They surrounded the defendant box, securing their grips on the chains binding my family. The loud metallic rattling of handcuffs and shackles filled the room as the marshals forcefully guided them out from behind the wooden partition. Vivian was weeping openly, her shoulders shaking as a female marshal guided her toward the heavy steel side door that led back to the holding cells. Jeremiah shuffled forward, his head bowed, completely unable to look at the congregation members who were silently watching his disgrace. Preston stumbled slightly, his arrogant posture completely broken as a large marshal firmly directed him forward. Then came Chloe. My sister walked slowly, her orange jumpsuit hanging loosely over her small frame. The golden child who had been groomed her entire life to be the flawless face of a corrupt empire was now completely stripped of her value. She had lost her campaign, her marriage, and her parents all in a single devastating night. As the marshal guided her toward the heavy steel door, Chloe suddenly stopped. She dug her heels into the carpet, forcing the marshal to pause for a brief second. She turned her head and looked back up at the bench. The dark purple bruise on her cheekbones stood out sharply against her pale skin. Her eyes were red and swollen, stripped of all the manipulative vanity she had wielded since childhood. She looked at me not as a political candidate looking at a judge, but as a broken woman looking at the sister she had relentlessly tormented. The heavy courtroom was silent enough that her voice carried up to the bench. It was a fragile, raw whisper completely devoid of any performance or entitlement. "I am sorry," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with the crushing weight of total realization. I looked down at her. I saw the absolute devastation in her eyes. She finally understood that the elite world she had sacrificed everything to conquer was nothing but a toxic illusion. I did not smile. I did not offer her a dramatic speech about forgiveness or redemption. I simply gave her a single slow nod, acknowledging that the apology was heard, and recognizing the brutal truth of her surrender. But an apology does not erase a felony. I did not raise my hand. I did not stop the marshals. The federal officer gently but firmly placed his hand on her shoulder, turning her away from the bench and guiding her through the heavy steel door. The heavy metal slammed shut behind her, the heavy locks engaging with a loud final click that sealed their fate. I watched the heavy steel door click shut behind my sister. The metallic echo reverberated through the silent courtroom, marking the absolute end of the Sterling family empire. I sat alone at the elevated bench for a long moment, letting the profound gravity of the morning settle over me. For 34 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their expectations, their relentless criticism, and their toxic demands for obedience. They had tried to bury me under their country club prestige and megachurch hypocrisy, but they dug a grave for a seed. I had grown into a tree with roots so deep they could never be pulled up. I slowly stood from the leather chair and stepped down from the dais. The remaining gallery members, including the stunned reporters and the disillusioned church deacons, watched in respectful silence as I exited through the private judicial door. The thick mahogany sealed behind me, cutting off the chaotic whispers of the courtroom and wrapping me in the quiet sanctuary of the judge's corridor. I walked the familiar path to my private chambers, my heels clicking rhythmically against the carpet. When I reached my office, I closed the door and stood in the center of the room. I reached up and grasped the hidden zipper of my black judicial robe. As I pulled it down and slipped the heavy fabric off my shoulders, a physical sensation of immense relief washed over my entire body. It was not just the release of the judicial garment. It was the absolute shedding of 30 years of generational trauma. The scapegoat narrative my mother had violently forced onto me, the worthless dropout label my father had broadcast to his congregation, and the bitter jealousy my sister had weaponized against me, all dissolved into nothing. I was free. I draped the robe carefully over its wooden hanger, treating it with the reverence it deserved. It was the armor I had earned through grueling late-night study sessions, massive student loan debt, and unyielding dedication to the truth. I turned toward the seating area of my chambers, and the sterile atmosphere of the federal building instantly gave way to genuine warmth. This was my actual family. They were not bound to me by blood or conditional financial transactions. They were bound to me by mutual respect and shared integrity. My senior federal clerk, Jamal, was sitting on the leather sofa, sorting through a massive stack of asset forfeiture documents. He looked up and gave me a sharp, victorious nod. Jamal had stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights, coordinating the wiretaps and drafting the emergency preservation orders that had flawlessly trapped Preston and my parents. Next to Jamal sat Isaiah, my partner of 4 years. Isaiah was a brilliant civil rights attorney who had never once been intimidated by my success. Unlike the men my parents paraded in front of me who wanted a submissive trophy wife, Isaiah wanted a partner who challenged him. He stood up, crossing the room to wrap his arms tightly around my waist. He kissed my forehead, pressing a warm, comforting presence into my skin. "You administered flawless justice today, Your Honor," Isaiah said, his deep voice vibrating with profound pride. I watched the live feed from the overflow room. "You did not just break their criminal syndicate, you completely dismantled their entitlement. I knew it would be difficult facing them, but you were absolute steel on that bench." I leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "It was not difficult, Isaiah," I replied honestly, looking up into his kind, dark eyes. The difficult part was surviving my childhood. Putting criminals behind bars regardless of whether we share a last name is simply my job. A low, rich chuckle drew my attention to the corner of the room. Sitting near the sprawling bookshelves in a customized motorized wheelchair was Malik Jackson. Just a few weeks ago, Malik was bleeding out on a freezing asphalt road deliberately left to die by my mother and father so my sister could win an election. He had suffered a severed spinal cord and massive internal injuries. The doctors said he would face a brutal lifelong recovery. But Malik possessed an unbreakable spirit. He was a housing activist who had dedicated his life to exposing corrupt real estate developers who preyed on vulnerable black neighborhoods in Atlanta. Preston trying to murder him had only sharpened his resolve. "I have to admit," Judge Sterling Malik said, steering his wheelchair closer to the desk, "watching your brother-in-law realize his generational wealth could not buy his way out of federal custody was the best pain medication the hospital could have ever prescribed." I smiled, walking over to shake his hand. "You earned that victory, Malik. Your undercover work and the financial ledgers you provided to the task force laid the entire foundation for this morning. My family provided the wiretap confession, but your bravery built the cage they are currently sitting in. How is the physical therapy progressing?" "It is a battle," Malik admitted, adjusting his grip on the armrest, "but I am not fighting alone, and we have plenty of work left to do." Jamal just handed me the preliminary discovery files from Preston Real Estate Firm. We already found 3 more local zoning officials who were taking aggressive bribes to fast-track commercial demolitions in the Southside districts. Your family was just the tip of the corruption iceberg. I looked at the 3 men in my chambers. Jamal, with his relentless legal brilliance, Isaiah with his grounding love, and Malik with his defiant pursuit of justice. This was my circle. They did not care about designer labels or megachurch status. They cared about the work, about protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. My mother had spent my entire life telling me I would die alone and unloved because I refused to conform to her superficial standards. Yet here I stood surrounded by brilliant, loyal men who respected my mind and protected my peace. I walked past my massive oak desk and approached the floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the far wall of my chambers. The morning sun was burning off the last remnants of the overnight storm, casting a brilliant golden light across the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I looked down at the bustling city streets, the government buildings, and the distant commercial districts. My mind drifted back to the front porch of my childhood home. I remembered standing in the freezing cold, holding a cheap suitcase while my mother slammed the heavy front door in my face. I remembered her calling me an ugly college dropout, screaming that I would never amount to anything without their financial backing. I remembered the sheer, terrifying emptiness of being completely discarded by the people who were supposed to protect me. They had demanded I surrender my authenticity for their approval. When I refused, they tried to erase me. But standing here looking out over the city I governed, I realized their rejection was the greatest gift I had ever received. If I had stayed in their toxic orbit, I would have been just like Chloe, a hollow, manipulated puppet completely dependent on corrupt money and abusive men. I would have traded my moral compass for a seat at their country club tables. Instead, I was forced into the wilderness, and in that wilderness I learned how to hunt. I built my power not through manipulation, bribery, or exploiting the vulnerable, but through relentless integrity. I earned my undergraduate degree by working overnight shifts. I earned my law degree by reading case files until my eyes bled. I earned my judicial appointment because my prosecution record was completely flawless. I did not need a wealthy husband to buy me a campaign, and I did not need a corrupt pastor to launder money for my success. I became the most powerful woman in the room entirely on my own merit. Isaiah walked up behind me, gently placing a steaming mug of dark roast coffee on the edge of the windowsill. He did not say anything, simply offering a quiet, comforting presence as I surveyed the city. I picked up the ceramic mug, letting the heat warm my palms. I took a slow, deep sip, savoring the rich, bitter flavor. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. The heavy manila folders from the morning arraignment had already been processed and cleared away by the court clerks. In their place sat a brand new stack of federal case files waiting for my review. There were corrupt politicians to sentence fraudulent corporations, to dismantle and civil rights to uphold. The work of justice is a relentless grinding machine, and it requires operators with steady hands and unbreakable wills. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair, pulling the first thick file toward me. I flipped it open, scanning the preliminary injunction requests. I thought about my mother sitting in a concrete holding cell. I thought about my father stripped of his pulpit and his pride. I thought about my sister finally facing the brutal consequences of her entitlement. They had spent decades casting me as the family scapegoat, convinced I was a weak, helpless victim they could eternally control. They were wrong. I did not just survive the scapegoat role. I became the law, and I was just getting started. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to bleed you dry. The most profound lesson I ever had to learn was that standing in my truth meant walking away from their toxic expectations. True power does not come from bending to the will of manipulative people just to keep the peace. It comes from recognizing your own unshakable worth and refusing to let anyone else dictate your value or your future. My family saw my independence as a direct insult to their authority because they could not control what they did not financially fund. They deliberately confused my silence for weakness and my dedication to public service for absolute failure. But you must never shrink yourself to fit into rooms that were built specifically to keep you small. When you hold your ground against manipulation, you do not just protect your own peace, you completely expose the fragility of those who try to break you. Blood does not entitle anyone to your sanity, your freedom, or your hard-earned success. You have the absolute right to demand respect and the ultimate authority to walk away when it is denied. If my journey has shown anything, it is that the ultimate revenge against those who underestimate you is simply succeeding on your own terms and letting the natural consequences of their own actions finally catch up to them. Do not ever let toxic family members write your story when you are the one holding the pen. If this message resonates with you, share your own experiences with toxic family dynamics in the comments and remember to subscribe for more stories of reclaiming your power.